Acts chapter 9, 3 through 5, concerning Saul of Tarsus. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting."
It's a privilege to be with you tonight. I would bring you greetings from the North MacArthur Church, but that's about 3 days premature. And I've normally been here for affirming the faith and for funerals. So it's nice to be here at this particular time. Many of you will know my younger brother Kent. You can be giving him some thought tonight. I did ask the congregation to please be nice to him tonight. A few years ago, when I was in Australia in the summer, Kent came, and if you know him, he's very lighthearted and being the younger brother and makes jokes and stuff. And in passing, he made some comment that he felt sorry for Eastside because they had to put up with his older, fatter, balder brother. Kent said after services, 2 elderly ladies pinned him to the wall, one at a time, and Kent said, "I haven't been spoken to like that in a long time." And it was kind of like wrestling tag team. Neither one of them knew that the other one was doing it. But he said both of them pushed me up against the wall, and he said, one of them said, "We will have your fatter, older, balder brother any day. You take your smart mouth and go home." So he told me, he said, "When you're away, sleep well, because there are people that have your back." And so anyway, I'd ask the church please to be nice to him tonight when he comes to fill in. We're going to be talking about our attitude toward the church, looking at this from the point of view of Paul. And I just want to do kind of a demographic to start with. If you have taught a Bible class, whether in the congregation or in a home, if you have taught a Bible class this year, would you stand? Okay, thank you. You seated? We'll give some of you a workout. If you are an elder, would you stand, please? We appreciate our shepherds. Thank you. If you have taken food to a funeral or to someone who's shut in this last year, would you stand? Thank you. Finally, if you have visited someone either who has attended, or I know the young ladies here recently visited shut-ins and other things, but if you just made a home visit for someone this year, would you please stand? Okay, thank you. When we lived in Memphis, it was at that time called Memphis State, and there was a university center, Bible chair there, and they would have lectureships, and I always tried to go if I could because the lectureships were directed toward many of the first-generation Christians who had been converted on college campuses. And so there would always be a lot of university students from around Memphis who would come. And just looking at it from the point of view of someone who was a new Christian, I was always interested in going just to see what are they going to talk about, how are they going to encourage them, what are they going to say. And one year the theme was just on why do I believe in the resurrection? And they selected, and I don't know if it was 5 or 6 speakers, but rather than assigning them a topic, they let the speakers assign themselves a topic and just made sure they didn't overlap. And I knew that was going to be happening. And I thought, how interesting to ask 5 or 6 different guys, why do you believe in the resurrection? Harold Hazlip, who was at that time was our dean, his choice was, he said, "I believe in the resurrection because of the conversion and the change of life of Saul of Tarsus." He said, "How else do you explain someone who was trained at the feet of Gamaliel, someone who was zealous for the tradition of his ancestors, becoming a Christian if he hadn't met the resurrected Jesus. And I oftentimes have asked the people at Eastside just to stop and think, where would you and I be today, literally, and what would we be doing if someone hadn't either taught us or our families the gospel? And when we lived in Australia in our neighborhood, I don't know if there was 100 houses or whatever, 4 of us, 4 houses went to church on Sunday. And I oftentimes thought if someone hadn't taught us the gospel, what would we have been doing today instead of worshiping with God's people? I'd like to read some things to you to start with, and this will take a little bit, but to me it's very helpful to kind of give us some background. I'd like just to read verses to you about either descriptions given by Paul or by other people about himself when he's Saul of Tarsus. And the thing that just came out as I read these again is that you just kind of shudder when you start reading these, because we know he persecuted the church, but I want you just to listen to the words that were used about Saul of Tarsus. We're introduced to him in Acts chapter 7, and notice what Luke tells us about Stephen. They cried out with a loud voice, they stopped their ears, and they rushed together, and they cast him out of the city and stoned him. Growing up on a farm, I've skipped rocks across a pond a lot. I've thrown rocks at things. I've even tried to pick up rocks and think, could I actually throw this at a human being to try to kill him? And there's a certain point I can't go any further. And I literally can't imagine in my mind what it would be like to either hate someone or be so against someone that you would pick up rocks and literally stone this person to death. As this is going on, the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. And the very first thing we're introduced to Saul is that, can I use the word cheerleader, protector, guardian? Hey, you guys, I'll take care of your stuff. Let's kill this guy. We find in Acts 8:1, Saul was consenting to his death. A great persecution arose against the church in Jerusalem, and they're scattered throughout the region. Saul, this translation says, was ravaging. Another translation says he was trying to destroy the church. Entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. He was breathing out threats and murders against the disciples of the Lord, and he got letters to go to Damascus to bring them bound. Then later, as Paul describes himself in Acts 22, he said, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. I journeyed to Damascus to bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. I was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth. As I read through these, and there's still a couple more that I'm going to read, at a point in time, it was so sobering to look at the focus that was a part of this man's life before he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. He is not just a casual opponent against Christianity. He's doing everything he can to destroy it. And notice these final terms that are given to us in Acts 26. He said, I not only shut many of the saints in prison, when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them, and in raging fury against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. And we don't know where this is at, but just think about this. Before he goes to Damascus, he has already made trips to other cities outside in order to identify and to persecute Christians. And then in Galatians, he said, I persecuted the church of God violently, and I tried to destroy it. When you read through this, you can see why the church wasn't very eager to welcome him as a new brother. Using our terminology today, especially if I was a shepherd, I would say, be sure he doesn't get a church directory. You know, he's against enough of us, but be sure he doesn't know where we live, because he's likely to bind us and to put us into prison. And then the very last part in Galatians 1, they said, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And this is our picture of Saul of Tarsus. And as Charlie read for us tonight, he begins a physical journey to the city of Damascus to carry on these things that are descriptive of him. And while he is making this physical journey, he has no idea that God is about to begin a spiritual journey in his life. And over a period of time, the man that we're first introduced to as Saul, then eventually will become Paul. And a starting point, a beginning point, as Charlie read for us, he fell to the ground and he heard a voice say to him, and I want you just to listen very carefully. You've heard this most of your life, but it still strikes me. The voice didn't say, Saul, why are you persecuting the church? Which is what he's doing. What does our Lord say to him? Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And as far as Jesus is concerned, if you are persecuting his church, you're persecuting him. And what I want to do for the rest of the time tonight is just to do the opposite. I won't give these to you right now, but just think of some things in your mind. If you're thinking of the opposite of persecute, okay, an antonym, something that's just the total opposite, what words would you use as the very opposite of persecute? And as Saul becomes Paul, these become the main features of his life. And the very first thing is, and I've already stated this, Saul learned that Jesus was as concerned about his church as he was anything else on earth. And while he wasn't there, the echo just comes in my mind, Peter, upon this rock I will build what? My church. And as Saul goes out persecuting him, then Jesus says to him, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Another thing that Saul learns as he becomes Paul is that Jesus died for him personally. And it's very important because we hear passages like, go preach the gospel into all the world, but a passage that we're very familiar with, notice the pronouns. Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ, nevertheless, not I live, but Christ lives in me, and the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith, and here it comes, in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. We're not given record of this, but I wonder, for all the years that Paul is going to be incarcerated, and one of the things that Ananias is sent to tell him in Acts 9 of all the things that he will suffer, but if you are Paul and you're in prison, would you ever close your eyes at night and see Stephen being stoned? While you're in prison as a Christian, would you ever close your eyes and see the Christians that you had killed before you met Jesus on the road to Damascus? And Saul eventually learned, Christ died for me. When he speaks in Timothy about being the chief of sinners, I was sitting with a young man named James, and there was a national park not far from the Quarry Church building in Sydney. And James is a relative new Christian. He and his wife had been baptized. He was originally from England. And as we're sitting there, he said, I'm so glad that we found the church so that my wife can be saved. And I said, what are you talking about? You've been baptized too. And he said, well, while I was in England, I know that I killed 2 men with my bare hands. And the third time I was drunk, and I'm not sure if I killed the third one or not. And I'm just confident that God could not save me, but I'm glad he could save my wife. And what's such an appropriate verse to talk about? If God could save who is called the chief of sinners, then God would be able to save him. And as Saul becomes Paul, he realizes that Christ died for him. The third thing is that Paul learned to live a life of humility and service. And this is just an acronym that I've used with small children. When I hear the word Saul, and I'm thinking of the Old Testament, okay, I think of the word tall. He's head and shoulders above everyone. And I'm in a New Testament background class, and the teacher said, does anyone know what the Latin for Paulus is? And of course, I didn't. And he said, Paulus is a word that means diminutive, small, or little. And growing up on the farm, I'm thinking runt. And so as I look at the transition, then even in his name, Saul means tall, and Paul means small. And he learned both to empty himself, he learned to live a life of humility, and even though he had spent all of his life trying to destroy the church, initially, as he becomes Paul, then he spends the rest of his life building up the church, and if I can use the expression, loving the bride. Saul also learned the value of having faithful co-workers with him. And after he becomes Paul, other than a brief time in Athens as we get to watch his travels, he's never by himself. And I oftentimes look at this transformation, and I think the biggest catalyst in the whole thing was Barnabas, the son of encouragement. And look at all the things that Paul is going to learn from him. Saul is also going to learn that you can live in good conscience and be wrong. I'm still struck by this passage where he says, brethren, I have lived in all good conscience up to this day. And so in good conscience, he's going to encourage the stoning of Stephen. In good conscience, he's going to bind and kill Christians, but he was wrong. But something that's also very important to me is that as he becomes Paul, he also learns in good conscience that his opinion can be wrong as well. When he and Barnabas have the disagreement over John Mark, they are so struggling with this conflict and this difference that they split company. And you and I know people who have made an opinion about someone and they'll never change that for the rest of their life. And one of the things I love reading when I read 2 Timothy, the very last letter, what does he say? You go and get John Mark, he's useful to me. And he learned in good conscience that he could be wrong. And Saul learned that one of the best ways to demonstrate his love for Christ is to nurture and care for his church. We know there are some letters we don't have. I wonder how many letters did he write? I wonder how many people did he baptize in his life? How many churches did he establish? And a person just looked at the parts that we know, and I'm sure there's others that we don't, but when you just travel with Paul around the Roman Empire, we can account for 10,000 miles that he travels, and a lot of that's by foot and in danger. But one last thing about Saul becoming Paul, and then we'll talk about us as we finish. Saul comes into the church at a very critical time. And there's some things about this I don't completely understand, but let me just give you the details and you can work on this in your own mind. The word disciple is used 262 times in the New Testament, obviously, often in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It will be used into the book of Acts, but then as you come closer to the end of Acts, by the time you come later, and it will be chapter 21, the word disciple is never used again in the New Testament. And just get your concordance and look at that, and let me just say it this way. Paul never writes to a church and refers to them as disciples. And it's like the word disciple is used over and over and again, and then as Saul becomes a Christian, it begins to decline. And then when the church is brought into being with both Jews and Gentiles, and when the church is what God called it to be, guess what we're then called? Saints. And for the rest of the New Testament, collectively, we're not referred to as disciples, we are referred to as saints. Now, I believe disciples are saints and saints are disciples, and I think we should talk about discipleship, but isn't that interesting? The complete terminology changes. And from the conversion of Saul, and as he comes into the church, all of the rest of the references, even into the book of Revelation, we are referred to collectively as the sanctified ones. Now, I think there's good reason we don't refer to people as saints today. Ethan, how would it be at Wilshire to refer to Saint Jim or Saint James? That just doesn't ring right. Saint Jeremy, it just... Because of cultural things, it just doesn't have quite the right ring to it, okay? But biblically, that's who we are. We're the ones who have been, and this is from Ephesians 1, we've been selected by God, we have been saved by Jesus, and we have been sealed by the Holy Spirit. And these are the people who are called saints. And as God brings Saul of Tarsus into the church, then he becomes a part of this transition of the reference to God's people. Rather than being primarily disciples, the term saint is used all the way through the book of Revelation. I'd like to give each of us 5 challenges to close tonight, and these will go very quickly. But just in this coming year, and whether this is as an individual, whether it's mom, dad, and the kids, or it's our church families, I'd like to give us 5 challenges, and here's the first one. As Saul becomes Paul, he preaches a gospel that first had changed his life. And we all need to be committed to being able to go through metamorphosis and go through the change from one degree of glory to another. And to me, one of the most interesting descriptions of Saul becoming Paul is that when he begins to think of the church, he uses this wonderful term, adopted. And you look at this and you think whether you are Jew or whether you're a Gentile, none of you are the older brother or sister, Christ is. And the people who are in the church are the people who have been adopted, brought into the church by the blood of Jesus. And you'll find these references in Romans 8, Galatians 4, and Ephesians 1. And this is just this wonderful term called adoption. We have a grandson who was adopted, and the day we went into the court, 2 families came out in tears. You could just tell something very drastic had just happened in this judge's courtroom. And of course, we didn't try to look at them too closely, but totally distraught. And so 2 families came streaming out. And so here came Kate's family and Luke's family, grandparents, and on and on. And here was a little boy who was about to be adopted. And I just got to thinking, if you're a judge, what is all the stuff that you get to listen to in a week? I don't know that we really want to even go there. Anyway, he told the bailiff, whoever he is, he said, close the door. And then he looked at us and he said, this is the best part of my life as a judge. We're going to have this adoption. This courtroom will be turned into a playpen. You can take pictures on my lap. You can go anywhere you want to. And for the next 20 minutes, we're going to celebrate that this young man has a family who wants him and wants to love him and care for him. And if you're a judge, you've worked with these attorneys, they did the technical stuff. And he was true to his word. He said, now y'all get together and let me take the picture and all this other stuff. And he was just so excited to be a part of that. In the bottom left-hand drawer, I don't know what he had for girls, but for boys, he had a little red car. And as the adopted one would leave the courtroom, then he gave him that little card to say, congratulations, you have been brought into this family. Okay, ladies, think about this. You have a husband and 3 sons, and then you adopt number 4. Where are you going to go to celebrate the adoption of the new one? 5 Guys and a Burger, right? That's obvious. And so as we left the courthouse, then we went to 5 Guys and a Burger to celebrate and to tell James, we are so glad you are in our family. And both to blood children and to grandchildren, every time I get the opportunity, I try to say to them very openly, I'm so glad you're in our family. And as Saul becomes Paul, he comes to realize the love that Christ has for his church and spends the rest of his time helping and encouraging that. I'd like to read something to you, and this was a friend I grew up with, and I had talked with his parents. They were farmers, had taught school some at this metropolitan place in western Oklahoma called Carter. There's a stoplight there and a couple of stores. They were not able to have children, and they finally decided, wouldn't it be nice to have children in our family? And so, without telling anyone, they had talked to the director. They went to Tipton Home, and they met a couple of brothers, and they didn't tell them that's what they were doing, but they had them home for one of the holidays, didn't say, we're looking at you to maybe adopt you. They sent them back, and then they talked about it and prayed about it, and they said, we would like to bring these young men into our family. Kent spent more time with them than I did, and he was in Australia when the father died. And so they said, would you please come and do my father's funeral? And so I wrote to Mike Nelson, and I just said, what does it mean to be adopted? And notice what he says. I was adopted when I was 8 years old. I was born into a large family. I was number 6 out of what became 8 children. It was a poor family. We were migrant farmers for the most part. And the last 2 years that I remember, I lived in foster homes and then in Tipton home. I remember a fair amount in bits and pieces of life before adoption. And listen, but I never knew what love was until I was adopted. From the very first day, Mom and Dad brought me into their house, I experienced something wonderful. Mom and Dad did not have to grow in love with me and my youngest brother. Although they had no children up to now, they did have an overwhelming love, wanting to be lavished upon someone. So they chose us, they wanted us, they loved us, and I loved being loved. I do not believe that we were ever anything less to them than their own blood sons. And it may have taken me a little while to recognize that I was now a part of a special family. But I do not ever remember ever feeling like they were anything less than my very own mom and dad. While I know I was adopted, I never knew what it felt like to be adopted. I only know that what it felt like to be the son of a loving and a caring mom and dad, and this was real. I shudder to think what my life would have turned out to be like if Mom and Dad had not chosen me to be adopted as their son. And tonight, as the sons and daughters of God adopted into his family, let's first of all celebrate the blessing, but secondly, be mindful of the people in darkness around us this coming year who are not a part of the family of God. And one of the most important things we can do is be a part of adopting and bringing people into the family. I'd like to encourage us this coming year to be diligent in praying for God's people and God's church. Her name was Faye Dillingham. She taught English at Oklahoma Christian, member of the Edmond Church. If I use the word a little bit eccentric, I think that's appropriate. In August and September, she came into class and she would have a black scarf around her neck, a black coat, and a black purse. She took them off in the same order. She got everything organized. And as soon as the bell rang, she started calling roll. And about 3 weeks into the class, she read, "My love is like a red, red rose," and she wept, and there were tears on the floor. And as 18-year-olds, we didn't know if this was stand-up comedy, if we were supposed to laugh, if we were supposed to cry, because here was this ancient 65-year-old lady reading a poem, and just tears were coming down her eyes. As we got to know her and as the semester went on, she told us, she said, "I was once engaged, and during our engagement, my father had a heart attack. He ran a small store. I was the oldest of 5 children, and I told my fiancé, I have to go back and help my dad because of the other family. And he said, it's either me or him, and you make the choice. And if you go, I won't be here when you come back." And she said, "I have to go help my family." And he was gone. She never found someone to marry the rest of her life. And then we begin to understand why she wept when she read, "My love is like a red, red rose." But as she talked to us, she said, "Every morning at 5:30, I get up and I have a prayer vigil for my students that I know where they are in the world." We stayed in touch with her even after we graduated, and every time we had a small child, we took them to see Miss Dillingham, and she laughed and she had so much fun. And we never left empty-handed. We left with pork and beans, we left with sliced pineapple, we've left with marshmallows, but we never left her house without her giving us something because we had come to see her. And even though she didn't have children of her own, she got up at 5:30 for 12 years that we were in Australia and prayed for us every morning. How do you ever thank someone for that kind of a blessing? And one of the things that we can do for the people of God and for the bride of Christ is to pray for her. I'd also like for us just to think about ways that we can encourage the church. One of the expressions that we have in our family is that as we travel, we're going to get to meet part of God's family we've never met. We were going to Carlsbad, and our middle daughter said, "Dad, do we have to turn off the lights here as we do in Midwest City when church is over?" And I said, no, we're just visitors. We'll be able to leave early. We literally got out of the car, and their feet were on the parking lot, and some teens were walking by, and they said, hey, guys, come to class with us. And we didn't see them for a long time. There was a Bible class. They didn't come to devotional. People are getting ready to leave, and we have no kids. And we were getting a little concerned as mom and dad, and come to find out they had been to a Bible class, and they were having this intense discussion after class. It was wonderful with the kids who had adopted them and brought them to class. And as we left, we had met a part of our family we'd never met before. We're blessed to go to a small church in South Texas each year in the summertime, and whatever the church is doing that week, we're going to do. And I'm always excited. We walk in the door, and Rusty says, Luke, you're doing Lord's Supper this morning. David, you're leading opening prayer. Mr. Hartman, you're leading singing tonight. Michael, and we're assigned things to do because on Memorial Day, a lot of people are gone, and it's a small church. And whatever the church is doing that week, we do. One of the thrills of my life is that Rusty said, Mr. Hartman, we talk to you with the snowbirds who come from Michigan and they never get to see you. Could we please take your family's picture and put them up on our membership board so we can show the snowbirds who you are and describe to them this family that comes and is with us. And so through Facebook and other things, we check on them during hurricanes, and they check on us during tornadoes. And it's just a wonderful relationship, but this is God's family. And as we travel this year, what churches will we be at in situations that we'll be at where we can go and encourage small churches? Heather was going to Santiago for the summer while she was at Oklahoma Christian. And you're a little bit apprehensive as a father to, kiss a daughter goodbye for being gone for 6 weeks to South America. And we're at the airport, we've got her checked in, and as we give her that last hug, she leans over and she says, Dad, I'm going to get to go meet a part of our spiritual family that we've never met before. Don Vincent told me that he and Carol were in Minnesota, and they were at a church of 13 people. And if you're in a church of 13 people and you have someone who looks like Don Vincent come in, what's the first question you're going to ask him? What are you going to ask him? Are you a preacher? He said, yes. And they said, we'll be delighted for you to teach the Bible class and do the sermon today. And if you know Don Vincent, he was ready, and he had everything on the go. And the Bible class went okay, but he was telling me this. And Don was the only person who ever called me bro. Did he call you guys bro? He would call me on the phone. He says, bro, I'm going to go down to St. Anthony's. Could we get together and have a cup of coffee and visit? And just to be a brother to someone like Don Vincent was a real privilege. But he's preaching for this church of 13, and the majority of the church is crying. And if you know Don, he's thinking, maybe I've insulted them, I've done something terrible. And when he got finished, he asked him, he said, did I do something wrong? And they said, no, we so seldom get to hear live preaching. We don't have a preacher, and so some of us will read a bulletin article or we'll have a tape or something, and they just said, you have no idea of the blessing that it is to hear someone in the flesh giving a sermon, and that just happens so seldom that we were crying for joy that you were here with us today. Wherever we find her, let's make a pledge to encourage and strengthen the church. Last two things are this. It's very important that in our house, and I'm talking about mom, dad, and the kids, that we speak well about the church and the leaders of the church. Sheila grew up with a family that had 4 children, and the expression was, as they went to lunch after church, most Sundays they had barbecued preacher and roasted song leader. And every Sunday, the primary conversation was, what's wrong with the church today? I'll leave this to you. Do you want to guess how many of the 4 children are faithful today? If virtually every Sunday the conversation was, what's wrong with the church? Those of us that teach and preach are human, and we're going to make mistakes. But if we primarily point out what has been done wrong, why should our children be part of something that we primarily criticize? And something that I heard Kent talk about, and he said, in my family there were 4 of us, and 2 brothers and a sister are involved in ministry, but in an extended family of 40 people, Kent said, and I got to thinking this is true, he said, I never one time heard a criticism of a preacher or an elder in the Lord's church. He said, I'm sure the adults talked about it at one time or another, but he said never before the children or the grandchildren. And a big part of why we're in ministry today is that the people in ministry were spoken of in a positive way. And if we are going to encourage the church, then we need to encourage and speak well of those who lead. We also not need to take for granted that people who are faithful today will be always faithful. I oftentimes ask people, do you know anyone who is suffering from too much encouragement? Just think about it. Do you know anyone tonight is going to struggle going to sleep because they're just suffering from too much encouragement? And one of the things that we can do is both to speak well and to encourage those who preach and those who lead. And this leads to my final thing tonight. We oftentimes read the passage from Hebrews 10 about not forsaking the assembly, and that would be very appropriate because most of you wouldn't do that because you're here on a Sunday night. But in addition to not forsaking the assembly, what's the positive thing that they're told to do? Encourage one another as you see the day approaching. We had a dear friend in Australia who lived there from 1972 until he died. And as Don got older and wasn't able to do a lot of things and preach publicly, on Tuesday there were a whole group of young men who were homeschooled. They spent Tuesday with Uncle Don. They did Bible studies and word studies. They worked up lessons. They did preaching and teaching. They sang. And he spent Tuesday with sometimes 6 to 10 young men every Tuesday encouraging them. But this was Don Klingenberg. He said, every Sunday, now that I can't preach, I have 6 young men who have families that I want to lay hands on and give a hug and give them a good word every Sunday. And Charlie can hear this. Charlie, I think you're a great father. You're doing a great job. And here would come this hug. And it didn't matter what the sermon was. It didn't matter how the song leading was. Don didn't go to be entertained. He went to be an encouragement to other people. Don't think I've lost my mind, but a lot of times at Eastside, and I'm sure I'll do this here, I come and sit in an empty auditorium and think about and pray for the people who sit in different sections of our church. Most of us are people of habit. I know Kelly's going to be sitting pretty close here to the inside on the front row. And most of us sit in the same places, and we know who those people are. And oftentimes I just stop and think of all the things that happen in one church in a week. One doctor visit can change your life forever. One car accident can just change an entire family structure. And it's important for us just to be reminded of the importance of encouraging people every week. I listened to a preacher who had been at a church for 50 years. He invited a dear friend to come and speak, but after the friend spoke, the minister stood up, and you just think it's hard to imagine the grace that would be involved both in him and a church to share 50 years together. And as he closed the service, this is how he closed. I love thy kingdom, Lord, the house of thine abode, the church, our blessed Redeemer saved with his own precious blood. I love thy church, O God, her walls before thee stand, dear as the apple of thine eye, and graven on thy hand. For her my tears shall fall, for her my prayers ascend. To her my cares and toils be given, till toils and cares shall end. Beyond my highest joy, I prize her heavenly ways, her sweet communion, solemn vows, her hymns of love and praise. Sure as thy truth shall last, to Zion shall be given the brightest glories earth can yield and brighter bliss of heaven. As Saul became Paul, he learned to love the bride of Christ. And may I encourage you and I to do that in this coming year.